Hi, I'm Mrs. Dowglass, Head of Philosophy and Ethics at Brighton Girls GDST. Welcome back to the next in our series of sessions exploring how to learn philosophical arguments visually. And welcome back to the CEO of Endoxa Learning, Julian Plumley, who is going to lead us through this session. Welcome, Julian. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks, Alexis, for inviting me again. So we're going to look through another argument using this visual argumentation system. So I'll just start sharing the screen to do that.
Now, this is one of my favourite arguments, and I think very soon will become popular with our students as well.
Yes, today we're going to look at, it's quite a famous argument, this one. It's highly philosophical. It connects to several other parts of philosophy, and it's within religious studies. And it's one of the arguments for the existence of God. So I'll click on this topic here. And arguments for the existence of God, there's a lot of them, based on observation, based on reason. And this is one of the what is called argument from design. So it's Paley's watchmaker argument. And if you know Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker, this is what he's referring to. So this argument from William Paley, he wrote his book in 1802, and it was standard reading in universities for decades. In fact, Darwin read it and was very impressed by it. And in our own time, Dawkins, he named his book after it because it's that argument he was criticizing.
Now, Julian, many of our students have probably already read Dawkins' The Blind Watchmaker, but if they hadn't, would you recommend it as a good read?
Yes, I think it is an important modern statement of the atheist position, because clearly Dawkins certainly doesn't believe in God. He thinks that science is enough to explain everything that we experience, and it's very well known, and it's not technical. It's easy to read.
And in fact, I think I borrowed my copy from one of our science teachers.
Ah, there you go. So I'm going to click on the button to start the lesson. So like with all Endoxa lessons, we've got the little assistant Doxa who's going to give you instructions and orientation. You've got the stages of the lesson along the bottom here. So in this case, it's 1 to 19. And you go through the lesson by clicking next. So here, a little bit of introduction. I've already said this is Paley's argument. There are also, at the end, we're going to look at some counter-arguments that David Hume, this is a very famous philosopher, Scottish, who he'd made objections against previous versions of the design argument. Paley was writing after Hume, and he tries to deal with them in his book.
Now, I particularly like Hume, not least because he enjoyed a good party and was an atheist at a time when it was pretty much unacceptable.
Yes, he certainly was a man who knew his own mind and was utterly devoted to his philosophy. He's Britain's greatest philosopher, without doubt, I think. And yes, he was probably an atheist, or at least very close to an atheist. So I'm going to start the argument by clicking next. Here we go. So remember that you can zoom in, zoom out using a mouse wheel, or if it's a touch screen or a trackpad, using your fingers. There's also zoom buttons in the corner. And you can click on the white and drag the graph around if you need to. So this is the first step of the argument. We explained in the first video what a step of an argument is. The blue things are statements, and this is an argument type through which this step goes. What's important about this is the scenario, and that's the dashed purple box. That tells you what the context of the argument is. So I'm going to click on that. There's a little bit about Paley's book. And I've mentioned here about the thought experiment that Paley starts his book with. It's very simple. It's just a man on a hillside, and he finds a watch there, a mechanical watch, and he finds a stone as well, and he compares the two.
And Julian, you've mentioned to me before that you can actually find his book on the internet for free. Is that something that you'd also recommend for our students to read?
Yeah, I'd read the first 4 chapters, and they contain what we're going to go through here. The rest of the book is more and more and more examples of similar design arguments. So there's you get most of it out of reading the first 4 chapters, and it's quite readable. Obviously, it's a bit out of date. It's a bit like reading a Victorian novel in the language, but it's understandable.
And our students are now well versed in Victorian novels.
Yes, yeah. Well, they can try their hand at some philosophy then. So the first step here, analogy arguments, what they say is 2 things are similar in one way, so they're probably similar in another way. And this step's slightly different because it's actually a disanalogy. It says 2 things are different in one way, so they're probably different in another way. So it's the comparison he's using between the watch and the stone to get him to this conclusion. So he says, you look at the stone and there's nothing special about it. It could have been lying there forever. It doesn't have any parts that work together, no kind of mechanism. So there's no hint that it's been designed. It's just a random object. Whereas you look at the watch and you see the parts that it has, and you see that they're all clicking and ticking and working together. And that immediately makes you think that it has some kind of design, it has some kind of purpose. And even if you didn't understand watches, if you saw it, you'd immediately come to that conclusion.
So Julian, how right am I to say that Paley's talking about not just design, but very specifically design for a purpose?
Yes, you do have to be a little bit careful because he's saying that the design has a purpose. It is a purposeful design. He's not yet saying it was designed on purpose, because that's saying something's designed on purpose includes the idea that there has been a designer who has intentions, who has purposes. That's actually a second step of the argument. So this step, all it says is that that the watch fulfills some kind of purpose.
Thank you.
Right, we'll go to the second step. And this, from this statement about the watch, we can generalize it. So you could make this argument about any mechanical device. So, and the generalization of it is that having parts that work together to achieve something is strong evidence of purposeful design. And in these little brain boxes, I put some of his quotes here. So you can see the quote from Paley. We deduce design from relation, aptitude, and correspondence of parts. So where you see something that has parts that are clearly put together for that work together, there seems to be a purpose to their design. And this statement is used later on in the argument.
And again, I find those brain boxes really useful.
Yeah, we can put quotes in them. We can put comments, bits of knowledge. In some subjects, like politics or geography, you talk about case studies, so that they're useful. And also the information we get here in the scenario is similar. It's bringing context into the argument is very helpful. But the argument stays at the front. We kind of make all the facts and the case studies things that you have to click on. So the argument is always in front of you and the first thing you see.
Which is great, because that makes it very clear for the student what is argument and what is extra detail.
Exactly, because when you look at an exam question, they never ask you, tell us everything you know about this subject. They ask you a question that needs an argument. So the first thing you have to know is what kind of argument you're going to use. And then the facts have to be fitted into it to support it. So whatever it is, the case study or the example that's right for that argument, but you need to have a grip on the argument first.
Thank you. And this is one of the reasons that I love this system, is that it just shows us so clearly what the argument is, and then you build up the detail.
Yeah, so we'll go to the next step now. So we're going to take the statement that was already derived in the first step and use what's called a best explanation argument. We've just used the word because here, and you can just read it like that. The watch has a purposeful design because the watch had an intelligent designer. And this kind of argument step is talking about what's the most likely way it came about. This isn't a logical argument. This is an argument from common sense. Just looking at it and from what you know about the world, what's the most likely explanation?
So if I looked at my smartphone, the most likely explanation was that it had a designer. It didn't just naturally happen.
Yes, exactly. And I think everybody would come to the same conclusion. So I'll just step one step forwards. And in a similar way, we can generalize from this. So the watch had an intelligent designer. We generalized to purposeful design is only explained by an intelligent designer. And if I click on the brain box here, it doesn't seem to be working. No, that's not coming up for some reason. And this statement will be used later on in the argument as well.
And our next step after this, Julian, is?
Right. Now Paley changes gear. This is where the argument gets really clever. Some background here is older arguments from design had done things like saying, well, the universe is like a watch. Let's say the solar system is like a watch. The planets go around the sun in a very regular way. It's like the hands on a watch. The watch was designed by someone, so therefore the universe was. Those are the arguments that Hume picked to bits. And Paley is deliberately avoiding this. So he's making a different analogy here, not the watch to the universe. And please do not write in any essay that Paley compares the watch to the universe, because he never does. It's a much better argument than that. So he compares a telescope to an eye. And this is an analogy, not a disanalogy. So the parts of a telescope are exactly comparable to the parts of the eye. You have a lens that focuses light on a certain point at the back. And he makes the point that the telescope has parts that work together in a way that we can understand. And that's definitely got a purposeful design. And the eye has parts that work together. So the eye must have a purposeful design.
And that's kind of pretty clear to understand, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's well made, the point that here we've got an example of a natural mechanism and an artificial mechanism that are exactly parallel. And his book, to be fair to him, he did a lot of work. His book is full of these examples, how things in nature are paralleled to mechanisms that people design. And actually, the eye example, there's a lot more to this that I haven't put here. He goes into several layers of detail about how lenses work and things like that, and how those things were discovered by lens makers making telescopes and microscopes later.
And one of the things I find interesting about this analogy is that we know that even today, with all of our amazing artificial intelligence and medical technology, that we still can't replicate a working eye.
Yes, the eye, I mean, it's pretty complex, but the clever stuff happens in the brain, I think. Right, so we'll go on from this. And we'll see how this statement we got before from the watch and the stone argument. And this is there. This is supporting evidence. This strengthens this argument. If you look, actually, I'm just going to go back one step. This purple line represents the strength of the argument. Analogy arguments aren't particularly strong unless you've got some good reason to believe in the analogy. So when you go forwards, you have this that you've already worked out strengthens this argument, and the purple bar gets longer.
So we need to have a watch out for the purple bar, for the length of it, because that's indicating the strength of that analogy argument.
Yeah, we'll come to this in a subsequent lesson. It's the easiest thing to do is to edit graphs and play around with this, and you can see how this works for yourself.
And
but right now, sorry,
can do that with their own logins.
Yes. So when the students can log in for themselves, and we're going to show that briefly in this lesson at the end, but in the following lesson we'll go into more detail. So this is the next step. So again, it's in parallel to the stone and the watch. In this case, we're looking at the eye. So the eye, we just worked out, it has a purposeful design. So the best explanation is that it had an intelligent designer. Now, this is obviously something of a leap. And if we just go one step forwards, now you see why he went to the trouble of comparing the stone and the watch. It was to get this statement here, that purposeful design is only explained by an intelligent designer. And that strengthens this step.
And does anybody disagree with that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, Dawkins wouldn't agree with this one. And we're going to talk briefly about evolution at the end of this. It's important to note that Dawkins would agree with this. The eye does have a purposeful design, but he doesn't think that that implies that it had an intelligent designer. And that's the difference between having purposeful design and being designed on purpose, which means you have a designer.
Thank you. That's very clear, Julian. And what's our next step from this?
So the last step of Paley's argument is probably the most simple, which is if the eye had an intelligent designer, let's generalize this to the whole natural world had an intelligent designer. And although that's a big step, he does do a lot of work in the book to add lots of other examples from mostly from biology. And it's nice to quote him at the end here. So we conclude that the works of nature proceed from intelligence and design because in the properties of relation to a purpose, subserviency to use, they resemble what intelligence and design are constantly producing, and what nothing except intelligence and design ever produce at all.
I always think you get a great feel for a philosopher by actually using their own words, even though at times it can be quite tricky.
Yes, with him it's not too bad. It's a lot easier than reading Plato because he's only 2 centuries before us, and English is pretty similar. It looks a little bit archaic, but it's not too bad to read.
And Julian, I noticed on that generalization bar that it's kind of just over halfway, but it's a good point, but not particularly that strong a point.
Yeah, generalizations can go wrong as arguments. That's clear. And in this one, what I could do is bring in more of his examples here, and to try and bolster this up a bit. That's effectively what the other 20 chapters of the book are doing. I just haven't put them in here because it would get quite complex.
20 chapters, there's quite a lot of chapters.
Yes, it's a lot of work. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to take a quick break here and look at some of the things that the student can use for help in this app. So we have down here a key, which explains what all the arrows mean and the colors, and basically how the diagram is made. So that can be clicked anytime. We also have this button up here called Help and Guides. And if you click that, it'll open a new window. And you'll get, these are the main two help items here. One is all the explanation videos. So there's a whole training in how the app works here. It's organized by, there are 4 playlists. And the playlists, this is the first playlist, and these are the individual videos if you just want to watch them one by one.
And I've watched all of those, and each of them is very, very clear.
Well done. Okay, and the other box here is on argument types. We've got a menu of 15 argument types. Here they are. And each one, let's look at analogy. What you get is the explanation video, the templates, and some examples. And that's for each one. So if you want to know how they work, that's the reference material for it.
Now, I found those argument types particularly fascinating, in part because I had never studied them before myself. And the fact that you'd said that some types of arguments have got generic strengths and weaknesses to them.
Yes, it's clear that the arguments that are logically valid need to be given a higher strength than the ones that are just probabilistic. And we've done that. We've assigned numbers to that. And that does have an effect on the calculations that go on in the background of the program.
Thank you. That's interesting.
The only other thing to point out is this button here is live chat. If a student has a problem, they can click on this and send a message or chat with us live. If you're within the office hours, you'll chat with us live. If you're out of hours, you can send a message and we'll reply later. So any questions either about the lesson or about the app, you can use that.
And I know we've had this conversation earlier, and everyone who is on that live chat is DBS checked, so it's absolutely fine for our students to use. Yes,
everyone's DBS checked.
Lovely. And our next step, Julian.
Right, we've got these steps here with, this is all about Hume's criticism of design argument and how Paley gets around them. I'm actually going to step over one of them just to save a bit of time here. Yeah, I'll go to the next one. Yes, so here, Hume's most important criticism of design arguments is his empiricism. And it's a foundational principle of Hume's philosophy, is empiricism. And you can summarize all his thinking about cause and effect. You could summarize in this statement here. You can only identify a cause through repeated experience of cause followed by effect. Hume has a position that really there's no such thing as causality. All that we do is see regularities in nature, and we call the thing that goes first a cause and the thing that comes after an effect. And therefore, you can only know about causes and effects by having seen them a lot of times. And this kind of design argument, this gives a lever against it. So if this is true, if you believe like Hume does, that empiricism is the right philosophical principle, then let's say you have no experience of watchmaking. That means you can't know the cause of the watch. And that entails directly that you cannot know that the watch had an intelligent designer. This is important because the same argument can be applied to the eye. So you certainly don't know how eyes are designed. So if you have no experience of that, you can't know that the eye had an intelligent designer afterwards as well. So Hume's empiricism is he uses against these kind of arguments.
So empiricism is basically the scientific method, that the way that we know things is through experience, through what we know through our five senses.
Yes, that's where all knowledge has to start. So his most important book is called Treatise of Human Nature, and he goes through it. He's building up kind of the whole of human knowledge from this basis of it has to start with empirical observation and nothing else will do. He's very much an anti-rationalist.
Thank you. And so where do we go from here?
Well, Paley does something quite interesting with this. He anticipates this because, of course, he knew all about Hume's writing, and simply denies it. He denies the premise that Hume needs, that this is necessary. In fact, I'd say he ridicules it. What he says is that no one would not believe that the watch had a designer, and that it's not necessary to know how something is designed in detail in order to think that. So, as you said, with the example of the mobile phone, you look at it and you assume, well, you don't assume, you kind of know that it had a designer at some stage.
So Paley's appealing to a combination of common sense and logic?
Yes, he's using his common sense and then just using the logic to turn the argument the other way around. So in the system, the colors, blue is true, red is false. So this statement is the same as it was before. We've just changed the color. That means Paley thinks it's false. And if this is false, this argument has no strength. So you can make this false, that argument has no strength, and then this can be true.
So the logical steps that you take or that you argue can change whether the following statements are true or false.
Yes, when you edit these graphs, if you start changing the truth values of these statements, then you can turn an argument from saying one thing to saying the opposite.
And the truth value is whether you think it's true or not with your supporting reasons. Yes,
the truth value is personal. So the principle that the argument graph works on is that the structure is objective, it's public. So we all agree pretty much on what steps of logic make sense, but we evaluate them differently. So you might say this is true, somebody else might say it's false, and those will lead to, those get calculated through the graph and might result in different conclusions.
Thank you. That's really useful because the students can be quite creative in this with their own thinking and analysis.
Exactly. It's designed so that the student can express their own thoughts in it.
And our next step.
Right. I'm going to have a look at one more argument that also is based on a objection from Hume. One of his other objections is that the I was formed by what he calls generation. That's quite an old word, but he means reproduction. That's obviously a different process to design and manufacture. And he says that's contrary. So it can't have had an intelligent designer because that's designing is a different process. What Paley does with this is really interesting. It's very creative. So he changes his thought experiment. And if I click on the eye, he says, so you're looking at this watch on the hillside, and then it manages to self-replicate itself. It reproduces. And then what do you think once you see that? And his point is that if you saw it self-replicate, would you be more convinced that it had a designer or less? Well, he says quite reasonably, I think, that you'd be so impressed. It didn't just tell the time, it also reproduced itself. You'd be even more convinced that it had an intelligent designer to make it do that.
Which is interesting because I have to admit my immediate response to that is, if it can self-replicate, could it have self-designed?
He does tackle that. That's an interesting point because obviously the watch that has just been produced, the one that it's self-replicated, hasn't been designed by anything. But he essentially says this can't be an infinite regress. There had to have been an original designer. Otherwise, you wouldn't believe it would be possible.
So we get the infinite regression argument that things can't just continually go backwards.
Exactly. He makes that point. I haven't put it in the graph, but that's an objection that he foresaw. So if you think that self-replicating watch had a designer, well, self-replicating is reproduction, then you can generalize that and say that being formed by generation, by reproduction, is not contrary to having an intelligent designer.
It's made a really good point.
Yeah, I think he disposes with that one quite well. I think it's quite a weak argument from Hume, to be honest. Yes, so this argument, this is how it finishes. So this argument that was Hume's is undermined by that statement that we got out of the self-replicating watch example. And you can see this dashed red line is an undermining evidence link.
So that's challenging the logic of that argument.
Yeah, and it brings it down to it's gone. It's been undermined completely. So there's no purple bar here.
Excellent. So students can actually see visually the argument, the challenge, and whether the challenge works.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just going to do a little bit more here. So we go to the last step of the argument. Here we go. On the last step of the argument, you always see the whole graph. And it obviously looks complicated because it has all the steps we've already looked at. But this is what you can change for yourself. I'm just going to look at this a little bit. So you had the graph explained to you step by step during these stages. And here you see the whole thing. Now, if I click on Edit Graph, you'll get a video to watch that will show you an example of this. I'm not going to watch that right now. So you'll go into the Edit part of Endoxa. So here's the graph, and you have these edit buttons. So you can start to add statements, add scenarios, make new links, things like that. We're going to do that in a subsequent lesson. But just now I want to show you the hints. So we've put some further bits of argument as hints for students who want to change the argument and just to give them some ideas. So if I click on hints here, and I'm just going to make the screen a bit bigger, because that's a little bit small. Here's one of the hints. And here we come back to Dawkins again. So this hint is called evolution undermines the best explanation argument. So this is the step of the argument where we had a best explanation from the eye being designed to the eye having a designer, supported by this statement here. And what I've added here is something someone like Dawkins might say. So evolution by natural selection is a better explanation for the design of the eye, which is clearly undermining this step. And then you can say that this is false. But it's a bit more than that, because philosophically, you can't just put a statement like this there and not support it. That's not good. So otherwise, you just have this statement undermining it and this statement supporting it. You can't really get anywhere. So you really need to do something to support it. And in this case, we've used what amounts to Occam's razor. So a simpler theory is a better theory, and that's called parsimony. So the theory that has less things in it is a better theory. And evolution is, in this sense, a better theory than invoking God, because evolution doesn't need God. It doesn't postulate God. It just uses the laws of biology and physics to explain itself. So that's some support for this statement to undermine. So you could take this idea and then add it to this graph, and then it becomes your graph. It's when you save it, it will be your graph that you can refer to later. Well, it doesn't seem to be saving. That's not good. But I'll just go back. And we'll look at editing the graph in the next lesson.
Excellent. And where do you think students should go next at the end of this?
What they should do next is log in and look through the argument for themselves. So I'll go to let's make the screen smaller again. When they log in, they'll go into this screen here. And they, as we showed at the beginning, they can find this lesson. This one is religious studies, it's not God in the world, existence of God, and then click here and the lesson will start. There's lots of lessons in here on different subjects. If they're purple, then they're complete. If they're white, then we're still working on them. And go through the lesson by clicking the next button for themselves and think about it. So if I just go back in, you'll see open the lesson. So they can go through and then start clicking on these things. Click on the brains, click on the question marks, click on the eyes, and really find out about the argument.
That is so helpful. And there's also the chat box, live chat, as well as the weekly support that will be coming through GDST. Julian, that has been fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to our next lesson.
Yep, I'll see you soon. Bye, Alexis.
Bye, Julian.